We don't know much about history. We don't know much about social politics. We don't know much about the movements which have been created down through history, which appear to be different from each other on the outside. But when you look at their policies and their goals, they all tend to go towards the same destination. And when you find things all tending to come together, as the song goes, towards the same destination, some people will clue into the fact that there's a common guiding hand here. Societal changes, it can be likened to a herd of sheep who've been in the same field for a few years, and the sheep themselves are totally unaware of what their purpose is. They think they're there to be happy and to chew the cud, and they know the shepherd. They know the shepherd's face as he comes in, and he'll smile and he'll whistle to them, and he'll even scratch some of their ears, you know. And of course, when he wants them to eventually move to another field, he has to motivate them and get them ready to move, because something which has been static for a long time, it takes a while to get into gear, you might say, without losing control. And that's how society is, because society has been planned. You might say we've been farmed, like Charles Fort said. We've been farmed basically down through the centuries for different purposes by a hidden elite and a very high aristocracy, which uses lower aristocracy to do the actual work, you might say. And when they have to need people for wars, they breed them up. They'll allow them to have more food for themselves. They always allowed them to have plenty drink, alcohol, and so on, and even encourage sort of parties and festivals. And that way, they knew they could keep the population up, because during the festival times, even religion would relax. People copulated and offspring were produced. And those guys would be the next crop for the next war, which was maybe planned 18 to 20 years down the road. And this is pretty standard all down through history. We can read about it from the days of Plato, where he talks about the necessity of culling the excess populations of the Grecian islands, because they were islands and they could only stand so much of a population. And even the influx of slaves from all their wars would become a problem sometimes. And they would arm these slaves and put them in the army and have them fight their neighbors, and that way they culled down the herd, you might say. And in those days, it was talking about quite openly by the aristocracy. Slaves were cheap. The aristocracy saw those of the non-aristocracy as a separate animal, you might say. And nothing has changed up to the present. So for this particular talk, we're looking at how society has been shaped from the 1800s in Europe and America, world over really, by different groups. And one of these groups will be the Fabian Society, which was established in London, England, in the late 1800s. The founders of the Fabian Society consisted primarily, at least as far as the public are concerned, with Sidney Webb, who was a lifelong bureaucrat for the British government, who tried his best to work up and kiss the feet of the guys above him, hoping that he would be accepted as an aristocrat one day. But his wife really was called Beatrice, and Beatrice Webb was from an aristocratic family called the Potters, so she was Beatrice Potter. It might sound familiar to people. And Beatrice Potter, her family, her father, was a sort of Halliburton of his day, because he would have contracts with the British Army, with the Crown, and wherever they went abroad to slaughter people and kick them off their land, they would devastate and burn down houses, and he would move in with his little huts that he'd sell back to the British government, and the taxpayers would pay for them, of course, and they'd put up these little shacks for the people that they'd simply dispossessed recently abroad. So the same system was in place then as it is today. Names change. Sometimes the names are actually the same family lineages, but through marriage, etc., we have different surnames from the female and the male lineages. So the founders of the Fabian were the Webbs, and of course we had George Bernard Shaw, who was a playwright, and just like today, the playwrights in those days were funded by the big corporations, charitable corporations, as they call themselves, or philanthropic organizations, and they would tell the authors basically what themes to write upon on social issues, and to write them into novels so that the public who read them would have their opinions of things altered in such a direction that they would be all for a particular type of change, unsuspectingly, really, that this has been organized by professional psychologists, you might say, at the top, because they understand the human mind, and through fiction we are programmed through emotion, where any act, anything at all, can be humanized in a way, in drama, as to make it palatable to the people.
He is the first robotic child programmed to love.
So the Webbs and Bernard Shaw, and a third member, H.G. Wells, another lowly born person. He was born into a family that had lost its wealth, a middle-class family. His mother became a housemaid to an aristocratic family, and H.G. Wells was brought up in this particular house where his mother was the maid, basically. And they had a terror, domestic staff had a tremendous terror of poverty as they watched factory workers passing the windows, and they used to be terrified of having to join them one day, so they became more snobbish than the people who hired them, the actual owners of the homes. However, this thirst for power, or to get up into a higher class, enabled guys like Wells to be picked for that very craving, knowing that he'd have no conscience in getting up there. And he was also employed as a fictional writer to brainwash people, basically, through fiction into certain directions and ways of thinking. A planned society was his general theme through fictional works, like Shape of Things to Come. Most of his works, actually, though, were non-fiction, like his Outline of History in 2 volumes. His son finished the 2nd volume because Wells died about 1948. So those 3 main founders, at least for the public's image, were the frontmen for the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society was funded by the British aristocracy, not the British working class. And the British working class were taught that this was actually formed for them. It was on the side of Labour. And out of that came the Labour Party of Britain, in fact. And at the top of the Labour Party of Britain, the Fabian Society still rules. And on the stained glass window in the home of Mrs. Webb in London, you'll see the portrait, the actual stained glass portrait of the founders, and 2 of them are hammering the world into shape on an anvil. So in other words, the elite, the intellectual, scientific elite, are beating the world into the proper shape, you might say, the way it should be, the reshaping of society, symbolized as the world. Now, Bertrand Russell was another member of this group. Bertrand Russell was an aristocrat. His father was Lord Amberley, who was heavily involved in politics. He had a seat in the House of Lords, which is the British Senate, basically, although you inherit the title. And Bertrand Russell was born in the early 1870s. The same man was running the anti-war movement in 1960. Still out in front of the crowds, and he ran the Committee of 100, they called it, which was the radical group of the anti-war protest movement. This particular group would smash down and cut through the fences at air bases and storm onto the runway and destroy things. So here again, you have an aristocrat funded through the Fabian Society, pretending to be on the working man's side, leading vast amounts of people who'd fallen for his spiel. And these guys always have a very good spiel, you see. And yet this lord, this particular lord, had nothing in common with the working class. Nothing whatsoever. In fact, he never mixed with them apart from the mobs that he would speak in front. He wouldn't mix with them because he had nothing in common with them. He was a eugenicist. He believed in superior breeding and the breeding of intellect into people. He believed in abortion, birth control, and eugenics, meaning mandatory abortion for certain people below IQ levels of whatever. And Lord Bertrand Russell was a big, big player as far as the public are concerned, because he wrote so many books which can use certain truths and certain facts to bring you to a preconceived conclusion, knowing you must arrive by the way the information is presented. Most of the facts you arrive at, actually, or the conclusions you come to, are arrived at because they omit other facts, and that's how most of these conclusions are reached.